Why are we doing a sermon series organized around the Apostles' Creed? Don't we have this song? It goes, "My faith has found a resting place, not in device or creed." Like, what are we doing organizing a sermon series around a creed? The word creed comes from the Latin word credo, which means I believe. And you might say, well, we just believe in Jesus, not a creed. Yes, but as soon as someone asks you, what do you believe about Jesus? Or who is this Jesus you believe in? What comes out of your mouth next is going to be credo, I believe. Just like Jesus in Matthew chapter 16 asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What Peter just confessed was a credo, a belief, a statement of faith. Paul said also, we believe, therefore we speak. Faith has to be put into words. And this is a very ancient way in which Christians have summarized the Christian faith into words. So I think that this is very important. We can't help use words and creedal formulations in stating what we believe, but in addition to that, there are three ways in which I think this is going to be helpful. So this is a preface to the sermon, okay, just so you know what we're doing, which is also a preface to the entire series, okay. So I think studying the Apostles' Creed, or the Apostles' Creed itself, gives us a handle, a vocabulary, and a story, all right? A handle, first of all. It gives us a handle. Have you ever tried to pick up a box or a piece of furniture so big you can't get your arms around it? It's really hard. And you're like, I wish they put a handle on this thing, because even if you can't stretch your arms around it, if you can get a handle on it, you can lift it, right? Now, the Christian faith is so big, we really can't get our mind's arms around it. But if we could have a handle on it, we could at least make it portable to us. That's what the Apostles' Creed does. It doesn't reduce the Christian faith, but it gives us a handle on the Christian faith so that we can access it, so it's more portable and accessible to us. But the Creed not only gives us a handle, it also gives us a story, or rather a vocabulary. It gives us words. So these are words, right? We have to explain the Christian faith in words. Did you know that the more words you have for something, the better you appreciate it? The more words you have for something, the better you appreciate it. For example, a lot of us will walk outside today. I don't know if there's clouds. I haven't been outside since it was dark, but I don't know if there's clouds in the sky. Are there clouds in the sky? Maybe it's perfectly clear. I don't know. But anyway, let's say there's clouds in the sky, and you go out there, you're like, oh, to most of us, they're just clouds, right? But to a meteorologist, there's cirrus clouds, and there's cumulocirrus, and there's stratocirrus, and there's the cumulus cloud. It's that big, huge, fluffy cloud. And if it's shaped like an anvil, and if it's dark, and there's lightning that's flashing within it, it's a cumulonimbus. So suddenly you have more words for something that otherwise you wouldn't really notice, and the more words you have for something, the more you appreciate it. The same goes with colors. Now, we guys have a limited vocabulary when it comes to colors, right? For some reason, women have a much more expansive vocabulary when it comes to colors, and therefore, generally, they appreciate colors a lot more. Right? To this day, I'm not sure that I could identify mauve. All right? I know it's a word, but if someone pointed it out to me, but I'm sure that if I were to be able to connect words with colors, then I would be able to think more intelligently about colors. In fact, they tell me, I've read about this, that languages that have more words for colors, the people that speak those languages notice those colors more than people that don't have words for those colors. Isn't that interesting? And so what I'm telling you is this: the more accurate words we have to communicate the Christian faith, the more we will appreciate the Christian faith. So the Apostles' Creed does that for us. It gives us words. So it gives us a handle to hold it. It gives us words to describe it. But it also gives us a story. And my friends, this is incredibly important in our culture right now. 2025, here in Concord, New Hampshire, we are, as modern people, starved for meaningful stories. And by stories, I don't mean interesting anecdotes about things. I mean a plot line, a narrative that makes sense of our lives. Like, I've been reading this philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, and he's saying that in the modern life, we have so much, we are drowning in a tsunami of information that's accessible through our smartphones, social media. We're drowning information, but we are starving for meaning. We can access almost any single factoid on the planet at the snap of a finger, right at our fingertips. But how to connect all these facts in a meaningful narrative arc that helps us understand our place in it. We're totally disoriented. And it's not for lack of information, it's because of a superabundance of information that gets pumped to us all the time. And therefore, we as modern people are very bewildered about the story that we're part of. Now, the Apostles' Creed tells the story. It plots us in a particular narrative that begins with God as the creator and his creation of the world, and that goes through and talks about the fall of humankind and the coming of Jesus Christ and the sending of the Holy Spirit and the establishment of the church and a future day when Christ will return. That's the story, that's the narrative that we're a part of, right? And without that story, our lives feel meaningless and empty, and we're starved for a plot line upon which to orient our lives. So I'm just giving you 3 reasons here as a preface to this entire series that I think the Apostles' Creed is good for us to have a series organized by, because it gives us a handle, it gives us words, a richer vocabulary for the Christian faith, but it also gives us a story, the proper story of the Bible that tells us what is happening from beginning to end, from the very beginning into the future. So that is why three of the many reasons that I think that this series is incredibly important for us to deal with. Now, my plan throughout this series is to take a statement of the Apostles' Creed and preach on a passage from the Bible that is associated with it. And the passage that I've chosen to unfold to you this morning is from Romans chapter 1. It was the passage that was just read to you, verses 16 through 25. Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through 25. So when construction workers build a house, before they build the walls, before they build the ceilings, before they put the roof on, what do? They lay the foundation. Because if the foundation isn't right, if the foundation isn't laid, nothing else is right about that structure. And so it is with your life. Unless there is a foundation of belief in God, nothing else is right. The Creed states, from the very beginning, I believe in God. And that statement in the Creed, and that belief for Christians, is not just a basement level belief, it's a foundational belief. It undergirds everything we do and the way we think. And this passage in Romans is very important because it teaches us that God's existence is evident to every human being, but it also teaches us what we have done with that evidence and how we've turned away from it naturally and what God has to offer for us. So I'm going to make from this passage and other passages in Romans 4 statements, and they are these. First of all, God exists. Second, and I'm going to reverse the order that you might see in your worship guide, we have a problem. Third, God has an identity. Fourth, God has an offer. And with each statement, I want to attach a question for you to consider personally. I mean, everybody here, I don't really care how long you've been a Christian, but God exists. Do you believe it? We have a problem. Can you feel it? God has an identity. Do you know it? God has an offer. Will you receive it? First of all, God exists. Do you believe it? God exists. Do you believe it? Look at the text. Verse 19. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. This is absolutely fundamental, foundational teaching to everything that Christians believe about the existence of God. And it teaches us that although God is invisible, he is not imperceptible. In other words, you can't see God, but you also can't deny that he exists, or at least not be rational and deny that he exists. He's invisible, but he's not imperceptible. In fact, his existence is so evident that anyone who denies it is, as Paul says, without excuse. There is unignorable witness to God's existence. And we see in the first 2 chapters of Romans 2 main categories of evidence that God exists. God exists? Okay, how do we know? Well, we just read the first one, and that is, it is through the things that God has created. So the entire created order the world, the universe, bears witness to the existence of a transcendent, powerful, wise being. Psalm 19, verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies above declare his handiwork." So Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." So you look at the very fact of existence, you look at the intricacy of the created world, you look at the fact that woven into biological life is an intelligence that blows our mind, and most people just look at this. In fact, the vast majority of people throughout history and around the world today there's no question in their minds that there is a God. Something brought this into being. And it's not just the fact of nature. It's not the fact of existence, but it's the nature of existence. It's like how complex these things are, how intricate they are. Even things like music. For example, the famous 20th century American musician Leonard Bernstein felt this way about music when he would hear especially the music of Beethoven. He would say things like, about Beethoven's music, he said, "Rightness, that's the word. When you get the feeling that whatever note succeeds the last is the only possible note that could possibly happen at that very instance," he says, "that's when you feel that there's something transcendent. There's something right in the world. There's something heavenly. There's something that transcends this existence." For him, it was music. For other people, it has been investigating DNA that bears witness to the existence of God. God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived. Creation, so evidence for God's existence. Number one, creation. Number two, conscience. Conscience. So look at chapter 2 and we'll start in verse 14. If you could it's probably on the same page facing chapter 1. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 says this, "When Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." So not only do we have this outward witness to the existence of God, but we have something right inside us that tells us there's a right and wrong. Now, this is not to say that everybody lines up on what they believe is right or wrong. It just is to say that we all have a sense that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Now, people get this wrong all the time. I mean, every culture has their different opinions about what is appropriate or inappropriate. But the fact is, every culture has an idea that there is such a thing as appropriateness or inappropriateness. It's just woven into the pattern of our thinking. What is this? It's evidence that this creator that made everything, it's infinitely wise and abundantly powerful, is also a God who cares about morality, who cares about the difference between right and wrong, true and false. So creation and conscience are at least two ways in which God makes his existence known. Now, this raises an important question I want everybody to think about. Why then, if it is, according to the Bible, so abundantly evident that God exists from creation and conscience, why do some people deny his existence? Why are some people called atheists? Now, you may be an atheist, all right? You may have come here this morning, and maybe you've come here for some time, and you firmly believe that there is no God. Or maybe you don't consider yourself an atheist, but you would consider yourself an agnostic, which means whether or not God exists, I can't know. You're just going to leave it an open question. And this is the way that an increasing number of people are tending to identify themselves. So let me just give you a little bit, let me talk to you about this a little bit. In the late 1900s, last century, doesn't that make us feel old to remember the 1900s? Anyway, the late 1900s, a movement began that's now called the New Atheism. And you may recognize some of the prominent names, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. And these guys were absolutely intent not only on arguing that God doesn't exist, not only pushing atheism, but also saying, and it's immoral and outrageous and absurd to believe that he does exist. So back in 2006, Richard Dawkins came out with a book called The God Delusion. And at the beginning of the book, he says, if you believe in God when you start reading this book, read it to the end and you'll lose your faith by the end of this book. I picked up that book in 2008, shortly after my wife and I were married, and I started reading it. And I told my wife, I said, Richard Dawkins says, if I read this book from beginning to the end, I'll lose my faith. Now, Krista's prayer life intensified I was ready for the challenge. But the thing that was startling to me about Dawkins' claim there about why people believe in God, he says, why is it, if it's so patently absurd to believe that God exists, why does almost everybody, believe that there is such a thing as God or the gods? And his theory, and this is the theory of many other people, is that it must have to do with some evolutionary misfiring. Evolution went wrong somewhere way back when, and now we have natural selection has left us with this weird, useless item called belief in God that's resided somehow in the depths of our brains that people still have. That's why people still believe in God. I don't know if Dawkins ever saw the fatal flaw of that thinking, but it is this. If everything you think is if everything in your mind is the result of natural selection, then Mr. Dawkins, so is your belief in natural selection. Which is, why should you then trust it? So since the late 1900s and the early 2000s, this new atheism, this aggressive form of atheism, has really nosedived. It's not much of a thing anymore. And that's one of the reasons why. It's because it couldn't stand up under the weight of its own arguments. It would collapse. It was unsustainable. And so this whole argument against the existence of God and all these things, it really has not had the popularity that it was promised. And in fact, many people who claim to be atheists worry about the fact that they can't trust their senses. Thomas Nagel, for example, an American atheist philosopher, admitted the problem in a book. He said that the evolutionary story tells against confidence that we could trust our reason at all. This also was Charles Darwin's fear. He called it, in a private letter to a friend, he called it his horrid doubt. I'll read this to you. It's very interesting. Darwin, this is Charles Darwin, author of The Origin of Species, like the father of the modern theory of biological evolution. He said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value at all or trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" He called this his horrid doubt. If this theory of origins is true, we can't trust our own minds. And this is one of the reasons I think that new atheism has failed. But it continues to exert some force. And so if you've been influenced by it, I would just invite you to consider, if you have been influenced by the arguments of these new atheists, or if you know people that have been influenced by the arguments of these new atheism, I would ask you to do three things. First of all, consider the evidence. Consider the evidence for God's existence. One incredibly courageous, incredibly brilliant man who considered the evidence and the arguments wherever they took him, his name was Antony Flew. Throughout the 20th century, Antony Flew was one of the most formidable proponents of atheism. He's written dozens of books, and one of his books is on, several of his books are arguing against the possibility that God exists. But by 2004, very interesting, by 2004, he had come to believe that God actually exists. The three questions that he had to confront were: one, how did the laws of nature come to be? Two, how did life emerge from non-life? And three, how did anything come into existence at all? So it's very interesting. He published a book called There Is a God, How the Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And he was asked, he actually came out with this at a public debate at New York University. He was asked whether the recent work on the origin of life pointed to the activity of creative intelligence. His reply was, "Yes, I now think it does, almost entirely because of the DNA investigations." And he kept on insisting. So I would just encourage you, if you're struggling with this, or if you're interacting with people who are, consider the evidence. Number two, consider the alternatives. Consider the alternatives. The alternatives, by that I mean, what would life without God be? Some people don't have the courage to actually explore this. What would it actually mean to live an existence in which there was no God at all? There have been some thinkers throughout history who have been willing to, they had the courage to actually face it. And they actually said, if God doesn't exist, life has no meaning whatsoever. That's absolutely true. There's no way around that. And it's been only the most honest, courageous atheist philosophers who've been willing to admit that. Just this morning, I got a message from a friend of mine who told me that a family in his church lost an 8-month-old baby. and he attended the funeral this past week. And I was reflecting on that, these kinds of horrible tragedies are what drive people to think, if there was a God, why would he let something like this happen? I wonder if you've thought that too. I mean, the problem of evil has driven people to think there could not be a God. But if you would press the question even more, if there were not a God, then why think that anything is evil? Absent a good creator, you have no right to call the death of a baby a tragedy at all. It just is what it is. We may not be able to answer the question of the problem of evil, but without the existence of God, we don't have evil or good or anything at all. Because there are no moral categories. There's no right and wrong. There's no good and evil. Bertrand Russell, who is also a 20th century atheist, says that without God, man, and this is the view he embraced, is doomed to lose his dearest today and tomorrow himself pass through the gates of darkness. So consider the alternatives. A meaningless life. Number 3, consider the consequences. Consider the consequences of unbelief. Now, there is a very well-known 17th century Christian apologist, philosopher, forerunner, inventor of the earliest versions of the calculator, Blaise Pascal. He's kind of famous for something called his wager, Pascal's wager. And some of you might have heard it before. It's not an argument for the existence of God, but it is an argument why you should take the existence of God seriously. If God exists, he says this: suppose that God doesn't exist and you spent your life believing that he does. What have you lost? Well, in the final analysis, you've really lost nothing. Right? What if you go through life denying the existence of God, and sure enough, God doesn't exist? 10 years after you lie moldering in the grave, what are you going to care? What have you lost? Nothing. But if you go through your life denying that God exists, denying the God of the Bible, and you discover that he does exist, what have you lost? Everything. And if you go through your life trusting and following the God who exists as described in the Bible, and you discover that it's true, what have you gained? Everything. It's not an argument for God's existence, it's just a prudential consideration. So, God exists. We see this through creation, conscience. But what does it matter really, and how do we respond to this? And this is where we see we have a problem. We have a problem. Do you feel it? The problem is described in verse 21. So look back at your scripture. Verse 21 says, although they knew God, that is, although the evidence for God's existence is abundantly clear, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Here's our problem. The cause of our problem is this: we have exchanged what is true about God for something false. And if I could describe it this way, given the reality that there is a transcendent being that is infinitely greater than we are, infinitely more holy and more righteous, and then I take a look at myself, it is the natural human being's response to feel so utterly unworthy in light of that reality, but we cannot yet shake the sense that that reality exists, and what we tend to do is invent gods we can manage. See, everybody knows this, that there is within the human heart a vacuum, a God-shaped vacuum that only God can fill. But our tendency is we can't get rid of the space that's in our heart, that it's in our soul. We can't get rid of that space because so we suck into it things that aren't God, because it feels unbearable to us to accept the reality of an infinitely holy, transcendent being to whom we must give an account. And so what we end up doing is exactly what's described here in this passage. We claim to be wise, instead we become fools, and exchange the glory of the immortal God, the one true God, for other things. We worship and serve creatures instead of the Creator. Now, if if you doubt this or you need further confirmation of this, just think about the fact that everybody makes something in their life their meaning, their what defines their identity. Everybody worships, another way to put this is that everybody worships something. There's something that you're looking for to find meaning in your life. If you could put it this way, I could put it this way, without which you'd feel like your life isn't worth living anymore. Whatever those things are that you try to stuff into that cavernous hole in your life, whatever those things are for you are your gods. You serve them, you love them, you obey them. Those are things that we should do only to the one true God. And we can do this with anything. I mean, we primarily think of like idol worship as something that, bowing down to some gold image, doing a sacrifice like, they did in ancient times. But my friends, we bow down to images all the time. They're not gold images necessarily. They're images, they're gods of career or relationship or some position or an educational status or whatever they are. We serve them, we worship them. It's our default mode. Do you feel that? Do you feel that you do that? Do you feel that you have this inclination to make something the center of gravity in your life? And have you also felt the fact that it's not going to satisfy? I mean, when you're young, you might not be able to experience the disappointment of this, but the older you get, the more disappointing of a reality you realize that these things don't satisfy. In fact, some of the worst things that can happen to people is to get the very thing they thought they would satisfy, and once they get there, they feel so empty. In his book, Counterfeit Gods, Tim Keller, he deals with this topic at length in this book. He tells the story of a woman who desperately wanted to have children. She got married later in life, and contrary to her doctor's expectations, her dream was fulfilled, and she bore 2 children. But instead of giving them a happy life, her fierce desire to protect what she had longed for all her life, her fierce desire to protect and control every detail of her children's life led them to run away from her. In trying to make her life all about something, she lost it. But that's just one example of the kinds of things that we tend to do. We worship and serve the creature instead of the Creator, who alone is to be worshiped. And the consequence of this is that God gives, if we insist on doing this, God gives us over to our desires. It's the worst thing that could happen to a person is for them to get everything they want. It really is. There's a fascinating novel by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce, in which he imagines what it would be like if people from heaven could visit people from hell, or people from hell could visit people from heaven, and conversations between those people. But in that book, there is one character who says, there have been men who got so interested in proving the existence of God that they came to care nothing for God himself. There have been some who were so occupied in spreading Christianity that they never gave a thought to Christ. Is it possible to make even Christian ministry, and I'm speaking to myself as a pastor here, the center of my affections, the source of meaning, but not to worship God himself? There's these sobering words that C.S. Lewis gives in this novel. He says, there are only 2 kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. Because hell is filled with people who all their lives have said, my will be done. And finally God says, thy will be done. Notice the recurrence, and this is not just my idea or some literary moving flourish. Look at verses 24, 26, and 28. Romans 1:24, God gave them up. Romans 1:26, God gave them up. Romans 1:28, God gave them up. If when you heard the scripture read in verse 18 that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, and you're thinking, oh, what a horribly medieval, outdated view of God. You want to see how God's wrath is revealed? It's revealed by God simply saying, have it your own way. We have a problem. Do you feel it? God exists. Do you believe it? We have a problem. Do you feel it? Third, God has an identity. Do you know it? You see, God is not just creator. Yes, our consciences and our observational apparatus, our eyes and ears can tell us that there is a moral lawgiver, that there is a creator, but they can't tell us who he is. They can only tell us that he's powerful and that he could demand anything from us, but they don't give us much more information than that. But the Bible does. The Bible tells us that this God, who created all things and who was inscribed upon the hidden recesses of your heart, his law that tells your conscience when to be afflicted, he is a God who is pursuing you to have a relationship with you. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. This is the good news. This is the gospel. This is the identity of God. He's a righteous God. And he can't be he must be a righteous God. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. But in his righteousness, he reveals himself as a God who is in pursuit of you because he loves you. Romans chapter 1, I'm going to look at verse 4 here. Romans chapter 1, verse 4 speaks of Jesus, the Son of God, in verse 4, who was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. God reveals himself in Jesus Christ. In the beginning, John writes in his gospel, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And John writes, I'm going back to the Gospel of John. John writes that in seeing Jesus, we saw the glory of God. This righteous God, John says, full of grace and truth. Just the things that we need. We need grace. Yes, we need forgiveness and pardon and love. But we need a God also who can be a God of righteousness. And Jesus shows that God is full of grace and truth. And you know how he shows us it as a God full of grace and truth? The God who created everything. The God who designed DNA. The God who makes the oceans roar and the mountains rise, the thunders rumble. The God who did all that. He became a baby. He entered this creation. He became a human being. And he suffered and he died on the cross to bring us forgiveness from our unrighteousness. How does he show himself to be a God that is full of grace and truth? When Jesus was stretched forth upon the cross of wood, he was showing how righteous God is, how righteous, that sin matters. It must be dealt with. And he was also showing that God is a God of grace, because from that cross was pouring out a flood of love and grace. God has an identity. He reveals himself in Jesus Christ. And finally, God has an offer. He has an offer. Yes, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. But there is another way in which the righteousness of God is revealed. And I want to show that to you, but if you flip over one page and look at chapter 3, Romans chapter 3. God shows us how righteous he is by letting human beings who insist on their own way experience the full onslaught of their own desire. And yet, there is another way that God shows how righteous he is. Romans chapter 3, verse 21 says this, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness from God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe." This is God's offer. Do you feel that you are not right with this God who created you, with this God to whom you must give an account? If you feel that in your heart, never have you felt a truer feeling. But if you also know that this God is offering to you forgiveness through Jesus Christ, that is the good news you feel. That is the offer that God has for you, to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved. This is the offer. This is why it's good news. It's a good announcement that God has come. And he's not come as a tyrant to crush us, but he's come and been crushed for us. The essence of the offer is that you can be right with God. And the way to receive the offer is by faith. in Jesus Christ. Do you believe that God exists? I think most of you do. Do you feel the problem, the tension between God's expectations and our ability to fulfill them? I think most of you do. I hope that you know who God is. I hope that you see him as he's revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And for those of you who are still on the fence about whether you should put your trust in Jesus, I urge you to do that. In fact, the Bible uses the word, I beseech you that you'd be reconciled with God. Now, those of you who are trusting in Jesus Christ, you also need to pay attention closely to this word that God exists. God exists. The question for you is not just do you believe it, but do you act as if it's true? I quoted Psalm 14:1 near the beginning. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. If it is among the most foolhardy things in the world to deny God's existence, is it not even more foolhardy to believe in God's existence and yet to ignore it? To believe that God exists and yet for it to have no practical implication on your life? Think about what you're struggling with this coming week. Think about the fears and anxieties. Is there not a God who is in control, who hears and answers prayer? Think about the injustice that is causing your heart to just be in turmoil. The thing that was so unfair. Is there not a judge of all the earth who will do right? Think about the loneliness that you experience or the longings that you have. Is there not a God who has entered into a satisfying relationship with you that you could pour out your heart to? My friends, my believing friends, see, we cannot merely say with the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God, but it must affect every area of our lives. Yes, we believe in God. What difference is it making in our lives? Would anybody know just by looking at you that you serve an almighty Father who loves you, who is in control of the universe, who is king, who one day will return? Can anybody look at your life just by observing your attitude, your action, your level of anxiety, know that you have a God? If not, look to him. Remind yourself who he is. Bless the Lord, O my soul, as the psalmist says in Psalm 103. And give your life to him once again. I believe in God. We believe in God. Are we acting like it? If you don't believe in God, if you haven't believed in God, I hope this has moved you closer to believe in God, and to not just believe in a God, but to believe in the God that offers you himself in Jesus Christ.